All right, so our next our next talk is on disrupting poverty. So I'd like to invite up to the stage Julia Hartz. She's the co-founder and president of Eventbrite. And my friend Leila, Janah, who is the founder and CEO of Samasource, who we are both a funder of and, more importantly, a client at Google. And our moderator, Noah Wintroub, who's the head of internet and digital media at JPMorgan. All right.
Hello? Okay, so you heard about 3 people, and there's only 2 of us here. One's in a puddle somewhere in San Bruno, and it's her birthday. So unfortunately, Julia could not make it and sends her apologies. And we bought her cupcakes. It was her birthday. We'll leave those in the back for everybody.
I will say that Julie and I have been on like 10 women in tech panels, so I can basically recite all of her sound bites at this point.
And I promised you we wouldn't talk about women in tech. But there are 2 rules in life that I've always learned. 1, never go against a Sicilian when your life is in danger. And 2, never follow Tim O'Reilly on any panel, ever. So I blew it.
So we're screwed.
We're screwed. But I loved what he had to say. It was very intense because he talked about switching the constituent. And in a lot of ways, what you do is you switch the constituent and how to rethink and reshape the global workforce. So we're sitting here today in California, in the United States of America, in Northern California, in Palo Alto, at Stanford University, and within 5 miles of here, some of the greatest innovation in the world has happened. $1 trillion in the last 10 years, just in the internet sector alone, of value created, more wealth than any other place in the world. And we sit here in one of the poorest states in the world, and we also sit in a world that needs a lot of help. And so what I want to explore with Leila today is a little bit about her journey, because a lot of folks who are as brilliant, she went to Harvard, graduated in 2005, went and did the for-profit thing, and then has dedicated her life to starting something that really is fundamentally changing the world. Just to give you a sense of scope and scale, she's taken 15,000 people out of poverty in Africa, had 4,100 people get full-time employment, 2% of them stayed out of poverty. It's just a tremendous story. So I want to explore how, if we change the way that we think about the world, how we can make that better. So let's start with what you do. And what I'd like you to do is tell us a little bit about how you've done it, why you do it, and then give us a tangible example of how you work with a Walmart or an Eventbrite to make that happen.
Sure. So I am a social entrepreneur. I started Samasource 5 years ago, actually from this campus, from a very lonely corner of campus. I was a visiting scholar, had no money, but I had the legitimacy of a Stanford library card. So I clung to that really hard. And I had this vision. So my background is in international development and poverty alleviation. I had worked at the World Bank, and I studied this subject as an undergraduate. And I'd spent a lot of time working in really poor countries. And thanks to the field work I got to do, I got to spend a lot of time talking to very poor people. And one of the things that struck me was the disconnect between what a lot of the large aid organizations were doing that I was working for and the need on the ground. And every time I lived with a family in a poor place or talked to someone who made less than $2 a day, they would pretty much say very similar things. They would say, it's wonderful that you're working on this big structural adjustment program, whatever that means, or building this bridge, but I just need a job. So could your team hire me as your cook or your translator or your driver, or I'll carry your bags for you? I mean, I could not tell you how many people throughout my very limited time in this sector told me that all they wanted was a job. And yet none of us were working on that. We were these fancy academics coming in with our own ideas of what people needed. And so the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the central challenge, I believe, is to figure out ways to provide more dignified employment for really low-income people so they can spend that money as they see fit. And I was very lucky to, right after college and after this experience at the bank, go into a management consulting firm that sent me on a trip to India. My first client was a big outsourcing company, like one of those call centers that picks up the phone when you have a credit card problem. And I met a young man there who came from Dharavi, which is South Asia's largest slum. It's where Slumdog Millionaire was filmed, if you saw that movie. So it's open sewers and cholera outbreaks, and pretty much the last place you would imagine the guy on the other end of this credit card line coming from. And this young man was really bright and motivated and came from a rural part of India. And this little light bulb went off in my head. And I thought, well, if he can do this work, couldn't we train the millions of other people living in very poor places to do internet-based work? And maybe that could be the dignified work that we were lacking. And I read the world as flat, and I sort of connected these dots, and I launched Samasource to do just that. To provide digital work to low-income
digital
people.
work, you call it micro work, but let's just break this down for this audience. You have fundamentally changed the way we think about jobs and work. So what is digital work? And then let's take a Walmart, for example.
Sure.
So what are you doing for Walmart, and where on the other end of the line of who you're helping? Explain it and make it real for us.
Sure. At a high level, digital work is really anything that can be outsourced through the internet. So everything ranging from really basic data entry to virtual assistants to the higher end stuff that MBAs in big cities are doing for companies like JPMorgan. What I decided when I started Sama was that there was a segment of this industry that could be pretty easily unitized and that we could train pretty low-skilled people to do. So if they had a high school degree, they maybe spoke both basic English, they could probably do stuff like basic data entry, like see a receipt and then key in the numbers around that receipt. It's not rocket science, right? So that's essentially micro work. We get big projects from major technology clients. We break down those projects into small units, which we call micro work, and then we train low-income women and youth to do that work on the other end. And an example, I knew you were going to press me on it. I'll speak for Julia since she's not here, since she loves our work as a client. Eventbrite uses us for categorization. So when you create an event on the website Eventbrite, it's like an event ticketing company, you have the option to categorize that event, like I'm throwing a birthday party or this is a rock concert. And the Eventbrite analytics team relies on that data. So Samasource workers look at each of these listings and then categorize what the appropriate title is. And that's something that can't easily be done by a machine. It doesn't take a ton of skill, and it can provide more than a living wage for a woman in a slum in Kenya.
Got it. So basically, if I understand it correctly, you're mining two gaps: the knowledge gap and the economic gap. So on the knowledge gap, you're using digital technology to take simple things and make them a process that really anybody with a high school education can do. On the economic gap, what you're doing, if I get this right, is it is much cheaper for a woman in Uganda to earn a living wage by entering something for Eventbrite or Walmart or any of the great companies you work for, sustaining them and giving it back to Walmart, who would have to pay a lot to get the same task done here. Is that a fair way to think about it?
I wish you'd join every panel I'm on, because yes, that's a really nice way of putting it.
Yes, but how do you think about that, and then how do you frame that? Tell us a little bit about what you're doing in this country as well, and how do you get around people saying, well, are you outsourcing work to other places, which effectively you are, not in a bad way, but how do you think about that?
Sure, it's a great question.
You still wish I was on this panel?
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room, so we have to address it.
No, I think it's great. I'd love you to answer that. I think a lot of people have that question.
Yeah, I am, for better or worse, a pragmatist. And one of the biggest challenges I saw in the nonprofit sector, and I'm on the board of a large NGO, and I see this sometimes with them, is we have this idealistic idea about poor people and the way to help them, and I think it scares us to work with big, scary companies like Walmart in the nonprofit sector that might have living wage issues in other cities, right? So the challenge I see in not working with those companies is you're ignoring where the most capital in the world is. Like, to me, we're doing something really smart by getting Walmart and Google to pay for international development. That would normally come out of our tax dollars, go through USAID, go to a government in Kenya, maybe like 20 cents of that or 30 cents of that actually makes it to a poor person in a format that they can't even use. So kudos to Give Directly, as Jacqueline mentioned, for addressing that. But I think what's so interesting about our model is we're tapping into this entirely new source of capital that would never have gone into places like rural northern Uganda or slums and villages in India and Kenya. And that money gets directly into poor people's hands, and they can use it as they see fit. So that's kind of one element. The second is that we are an outsourcing firm. It's got a bad rap, I think. I think part of the reason it has a bad rap is, firstly, the industry is dominated by for-profit companies that do have a profit-maximizing incentive. I think we sort of turn that on its head by saying, yes, we're an outsourcing company, but we're a nonprofit. So our mission is to be sustainable and to reinvest any profit we might make back into the organization. Our success is employing as many people as possible for as little donor capital as we can, which is an extremely compelling case, I think, both to donors and to clients. And then lastly, I think there's a myth that if you're doing something internationally that you necessarily can't do something at home and vice versa. There's this big division, I think, in the NGO world, often between international aid and local poverty alleviation. And I just think that that's silly. I mean, interestingly now, the majority of people living in extreme poverty around the world, on less than $1.25 a day, actually live in middle-income countries. The bulk of them are in India and China. So just because a country's per capita income average seems like it's getting better, that doesn't mean that there aren't poor people in that country who we should address. And so that's not entirely true of the United States specifically, but we have seen some really shocking things happen here. The income gap today is greater than it's been since the 1920s. Our state, if you adjust for cost of living, has the worst poverty rate in the nation, as you mentioned. So we had this idea, why not bring some of these concepts to bear in the U.S., and that's behind our U.S. program.
So I will say it, you're amazing, okay? First time
Thanks,
I met
Janah.
Leila, I was like, holy crap, the world's gonna be okay if we have people like that in the world. So, well, I wanna get to that in a second, but just to put a bow on it, your vision is to change the way that we think about providing economic opportunity to pull people out of poverty by having companies and people do things that benefit them and at the same time pull people out of poverty, and it's just amazing. So let me switch the conversation. We have about a little less than 10 minutes, but let's say you need a good engineer to do what you do. So we're here in Silicon Valley. If you're 18 years old, you have a heartbeat, and you know how to code, you're probably going to make several $100,000 going to Google, right? So we have a system here where instead of star baseball players, we have star coders. How do you attract talent? How do people in organizations like this attract talent? If you were out in the world, you'd make a lot more doing something differently. So what is it that you have to do, or is our responsibility to attract talent? Can you attract talent?
So the challenge in my sector is we have to convince people to do a lot of irrational things. Like we have to convince donors to just give us money. We have to convince customers.
Maybe you could do that right here.
Yes.
I'm in.
Kate back there is our development director, so I'll let her handle that. But it's a challenge in our sector, and I think it's partly like we try to be charismatic about it and we try to inspire people. I think that at the end of the day, what people really want is to have meaning in their lives. They want to feel like they're doing something meaningful. And I don't know if you saw the George Packer article that came out in May this year. It was kind of skeptical about Silicon Valley. It was in the New Yorker, and he said,
Yes.
All these young tech entrepreneurs think they're changing the world by going to Facebook and Google, and maybe they're changing the world in one way, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't also work on food stamps and work on some of the issues that Tim discussed. And he said, the challenge I see is that all these smart young people want to go to Facebook and Google because they think that that's the only way to change the world. So I think that what it takes is to reframe the dialogue a little bit. And when I talk to people about the work we do, I say, sure, go to Google and Facebook, make some money, but then really think about the kind of direct impact you can make if you work for a nonprofit. And just do it for a rotation. Think of your career as several rotations, just like in a consulting job.
And do you think, in your heart of hearts, that we can have that sort of shift in sentiment that young people are going to do that, or are we fooling ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's still going to take a lot of cultural change. Unfortunately, I told you about a dinner I attended last night where a tech luminary told me that when I asked about poverty, said, well, poor people in African villages seem a lot happier than people in Beverly Hills. And I was just like, oh my God. But so that kind of thing, the unfortunate thing is that the tech leaders, the people who are the icons for these idealistic young entrepreneurial engineers, those guys have to say, go do this stuff. And what was interesting is that Larry Page was also there, and he said some remarkable things. He said, I think that Google should make it its mission to, maybe I shouldn't say this out loud, but to end hunger. I think we should do something bold like that, and I think that will build people's confidence in our company. And he said, he's really trying to inspire young entrepreneurs to start tackling some of these issues, as Tim is, and as Chris Hughes is, the Facebook co-founder, and I think Dustin Moskovitz is doing that too. So I think that's what it takes. It takes a lot of these guys standing up.
And do you believe companies should just do that, or do you believe companies should do that if it's in their owner's best interest?
I think that unfortunately, we have to be rational, and profit maximizing companies are incentivized to continue maximizing profit. So to the extent that these things serve that goal, then sure, it can work. I think that there's a whole middle ground, and Mohammed Yunus from Grameen Bank has kind of formed this new structure of social business where, we can create a new class of companies that's non-dividend and non-loss, right? So not losing 100% of their capital every year, but also not being wildly profitable. And microfinance is a great example of that business model. Low-income housing. We have a lot of examples of that in organizations like Delancey Street locally. So I think that might be the third path that is necessary.
So you talked a little bit about this dinner you had last night. There's a lot of resources and wealth being created out of new companies, new ideas, et cetera. And your great hope is that we can use that power for good. A lot of people, not enough, live by the mantra, to whom much is given, much is expected. How do you think about where are we on the barometer for folks who do have a lot? Are we getting better? Are we all here today because we're seeing a change, or are we going the other way and getting worse? Where are we, and how do we go the right way, or how do we avoid going the wrong way?
That's a great question. The optimist in me wants to say that despite the fact that the income gap is widening and that, we think we're so successful with global poverty because millions of people have moved over the poverty line, but yet, 1.4 billion still live in extreme suffering on less than $1.25 a day, and that's morally unacceptable. So, these problems are out there, and I think that things are getting better in the younger generation in the sense that people seem to be yearning for meaning in a way that maybe they weren't when I was younger. It's less acceptable to just say you want to make a ton of money on Wall Street. Maybe it's acceptable in certain circles. But
well, I would say Wall Street was the 90s what,
right.
Silicon Valley is to today.
Sure.
Right? If you want to use the parable, everybody went to banking. Now they all go to become engineers and make $1 billion.
Sure. But, interestingly, their idols, people like Dustin, who I mentioned, a lot of these guys are taking the billionaire's pledge and saying, I made all this money, but I don't really care about spending it. Conspicuous consumption for some of them is really out and déclassé. And I think that's what it takes. It takes sort of saying what matters is not, what kind of car you drive. Okay, you might make a lot of money, and that's essentially just points. And so once you've made your points, then just give them all away, because the point is not to spend them. It's to show that you're smart enough to accrue them, right? So one strategy that I've seen that's really interesting is, getting these types of guys to stand up and take these pledges. I think that's a brilliant model that Bill Gates started that's really catching fire. So I'm optimistic.
You're optimistic, but you're still okay with accumulating that much wealth, as long as when you die, you give it away, and hopefully you do a few good things in between?
Yeah, I'm not. I won't be too radical on stage here. I think there's a lot that needs to change. I think there should be a global wage floor. I think there should be a national wage floor. That's a living wage. I think all sorts of things that people would probably take offense in this audience, but I'll say that, sure, accumulate your wealth in a way that's not destructive to humanity. I think a lot of these tech companies are a net positive, and so if you can make a lot of money doing something that's not bad for the world, that's totally fine, and even better if you want to give it away at the end. I think personally you have a moral duty to do that if you've been lucky enough to, come into this wealth, but I think persuasion is probably the better route for these guys.
Got it. So in the last question from me, but just if you could tell the audience both from your worldview and what you want to see and how Samasource is going to change the world and what you're going to do, just give us your pitch on where you see the world going and how we can help you.
Sure. Well, firstly, I see an entirely new, exciting class of, what's now called social entrepreneurship emerging. Young people are really taking up this mantle of going out there and applying entrepreneurial methods to the social sector in a way they never were before. I think that's tremendously exciting. Personally, I launched something called the Sama Group. We did a soft launch last week. We're making more official announcements in the coming months. But I have this idea of building a family of enterprises like the Virgin Group, but in the social enterprise space. I think, for example, we should have a charter prison. We have charter schools. We should have a charter prison. The prison system is messed up. There are so many of these different ideas we've seen that we could actually test at a reasonable cost and at least pilot these things and use lean startup methods and then publish our publish our findings after experimenting. And so that's the mission, is to sort of have an incubator for innovative social programs that cost very little to test. The first one is Samasource. We launched a US program this year called Sama USA. We also launched a crowdfunding site for medical treatments called Sama Hope. And all of these things are now scaling nicely and have individual entrepreneurs in charge of them. So that's the mission, is just to grow that.
Well, my final question is, how do we clone you? But let's all give it up for Leila,
Thanks.
Janah. Amazing, huh?